My fellow Texans, please join me in welcoming Congressman Joe Sestak.
When I arrived in Congress 4.5 years ago, someone handed me a book, The Ambition and the Power, and said, read it, and you'll come to understand the institution that you're about to enter. As I flipped through its pages, I did read about honor with courage, command through leadership, and responsibility that one is willing to be held accountable for. I read about Speaker Jim Wright. Over the next few years, as I wandered through that institution, I went back and reread that book. I went to meet the author of it. I've only read taken the time to take one of the book and read it twice. Because I was struck by what was absent in that institution. And that was the qualities that the President and everyone else just spoke about that Jim Wright represented. There's a reason I speak like this, even though I never met him until tonight. When I arrived at that institution in Congress, it was the second institution that I had joined that it was at the bottom in terms of the Gallup poll of confidence by the U.S. public. When I joined up in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War era, only 25% of the United States public had confidence, according to the Gallup poll, in our military. And over the ensuing decades, I watched as leaders such as John Shalikashvili or Colin Powell restored that trust, which should never have been lost in our United States military. I watched that number go from 25 to 80% the day I left the U.S. military. And then I entered Congress, where once more I entered an institution that was rated in the mid-20s of the United States confidence. Read the book. Jim Wright took that institution in his years of speakership from well below 50% to over 70%. By the time I had left Congress, in fact, yesterday the Gallup poll came out, and they just kept drifting down during my tenure, and in the last 6 months to 12%, an historic low. I certainly don't have the qualities that Jim Wright had to try to change it. And why was he successful? I would argue it's because what some said about him in that book. There was one thing he certainly didn't lack: guts. How could he? He came from a family whose father, here in Texas, took his second paycheck and bought an advertisement in a local newspaper to condemn the Ku Klux Klan. Speaker Wright took to Washington, D.C., however, more than just guts. When you walked into his room, there were the sweeping horns of the Texas longhorn steer. But next to it were those words that he challenged everyone with in Congress. Don't tell me that it can't be done. Show me how it can be done. What Speaker Wright had is what any service member measures another service member by, and by which colleagues, at least in Jim Wright's time, measured their colleagues by, and it was character. Character defined by reliability, that you were a man or woman of your word. I mean, what else can you depend upon when you're in a foxhole? And next to you, it's just some other guy who you hope is going to keep his word to be there with you. And what other security is there, I found, in politics, other than the reliability of a fellow politician, which at times now is much too scarce. That type of accountability for your responsibility I learned from a young 19-year-old kid. It's the kind that Speaker Wright epitomized every day. And why, Mark, people stop when you bring up his name. Go aboard an aircraft carrier. There's 5,000 sailors. Their average age is 19 and a half. My mom would come on there and say, Joe, and she's a math teacher in high school, said, they're my high school students. And I said, yeah, Mom, I get them a year later, and they're great. On an aircraft carrier, when the pilot gets into the plane, they turn on the engine, and then they strap that plane to a catapult. Man, they push that button, and it flings you into the wind. In the dark of the night, Walt Disney has nothing over it. But sometimes they ask the pilot to shut down their engine, to get out of the plane and wait for the next launch. No pilot worth their salt will ever turn off their engines until they know that they've been unhooked from that catapult. Because if you turn off your engine and that button gets pushed, off you go for your last ride. And so this young 19-and-a-half-year-old youth walks out on that deck, goes underneath the belly of that plane, unhooks the catapult from the plane where the pilot can't see, and then walks to the front of that plane. He gives a very simple signal. He tells the pilot, you've got my word, I've unhooked. But then that kid never moves until that pilot has shut off his or her engine, gotten safely on deck. And that kid said it all for what Washington now lacks. Go ahead, trust me. I'm responsible. But I'm also willing to be held accountable. And if somehow you start heading overboard to your death, you're going right through me, and I'm going to mine. Today, polls are taken for political survivability. Decisions are made so that you almost offend no one. It's sort of like that senator, crusty old senator from Carolina, that signed off on a press release condemning communism, how evil they were, and godless they were. And then he had second thoughts. And he grabbed the aide before he departed and said, how many of them communists do you reckon vote back in my district? That courage is lacking that 19-year-old youth and Jim Wright had in Washington. But I was also taken, as I read this book, of what he did when there was a time when the House of Representatives and the Senate legislated. And that's principle of what he believed in. Was something I think we forgot. He viewed the American dream as an opportunity for our children to have an opportunity to do better than us. But he believed that government's role was to help create, to actually broaden that opportunity for everyone, whether it was nutrition, or education, or health care, or affordable housing. Again, I was taken with this book, of reading this man I never met, because so much of it, of his philosophy, and what he fought for with that accountability, is what I saw in the Navy, where I came to understand that the best part of our nation's character is that America is always driving and is always driven by an alliance of rugged individualism and the common enterprise, by people who truly are striving for individual achievement but never measure apart from the greater effort. Our country is the very first country ever that was founded on principle, not power. But it is a country that is built upon the belief that those principles, those individual principles, freedom, civil rights, suffrage, equality for all, will never be attained until they extend to all. It's the recognition that he had and that I saw in the Navy, that a fair opportunity for everyone means greater service to the greater effort, to the common good. I can remember arriving in the Indian Ocean, one night launching assault aircraft from the carrier in Night Valley. And one of those planes was piloted by a young woman. She disregarded the standing orders that night over Afghanistan, not to die without asking permission. U.S. Special Forces had been ambushed. 4 died immediately. And she decided she didn't have the time to ask for permission. She dove that night and strafed. And in the covering fire, the rest of the Special Forces got out of there with their dead. When I joined up during the Vietnam War era, we didn't have women on aircraft carriers, never mind piloting an F-18. Because that woman was given a fair opportunity to be all she could be in the U.S. Navy, our common mission that night was much better, and men came home safely. In the U.S. military, everybody has health care. Not because we're socialists, but because there are dividends that accrue to this nation from healthy warriors, productive workforce. We don't even promote you above a certain rank or rating unless you've earned a certain level of education as you continue through your career. Come on in and have an opportunity to be all you can be. I would argue that everyone in the U.S. military is a Jim Wright Democrat. They just don't know it. It's a wonderful venture that he always had and pursued. That investment in people, but the willingness for accountability from that investment. Much like that 19-and-a-half-year-old kid standing in front of that plane. What I was also taken by when I read this book is how Speaker Wright took command in a very unique, certain way. Burned into him had been a firm belief in equality of opportunity for everyone, but also tolerance, not hatred, not condemnation of either the other party or corporations. His approach was to try to build bridges to the other side, not by a compromise of principle, but by a principled compromise. It's why in this last century, particularly since his tenure, he is unique in that he was Speaker of the House. Not Speaker of the Democratic Caucus, not Speaker of the Republican Convention, as too many since then have been. He had a firm belief that those who wrote our Constitution never intended this institution that he so respected, to be subservient to the executive branch. It was to be a co-equal. That's what our forefathers foresaw. And his efforts to bring that about is what shook Washington. Changed the dynamics of power. Because Speaker Wright acted. He didn't exist. He took command. And he didn't take command for what is possible. I mean, that's politics, the art of the possible. What he went about to do was to act for what might become possible. And that was the greatness of Speaker Wright. As Mark mentioned, you'd have to go back to Henry Clay's time to find any speaker who dominated the issue of foreign policy, as Henry Clay did in the War of 1812. This was a man who took one of the two most important issues of the Reagan administration, one arms control, the other, as was mentioned, Central America and the peace process that Speaker Pelosi mentioned, and actually risked his speakership to bring peace to that region and also benefited us here in America. It was his belief, however, that we often get in trouble not by thinking too large, but by thinking too small. So he takes over as Speaker and immediately passes the Clean Water Bill, the Highway Bill, the Emergency Homeless Bill, and then, over the veto of the President, he's able to get them through. Talk about a debt crisis, read the one of 1987. Where the President said, "Over my dead body, will you ever raise taxes on the rich?" And yet, through his approach, how he outworked others, how he was willing to bear more pain, take more risk, and outfight anyone for us. He was able to have the rich pay much more than their share, while reducing the debt, while having defense pick up part of that burden, while protecting after a 22% cut the previous years in domestic programs of investment in education and health care to protect them. In my mind, you have to ask yourself, at least from my experience, where are those titans today? Those that would risk governance over partisan power. It's no wonder there is such disdain at 12% today. We Americans, you Texans especially, so respect guts. Jim Wright believed in accountability for responsibility, much as someone once wrote about the sea. He wrote that on the sea there is a tradition that with responsibility goes authority, and with both goes accountability. The captain of a ship is given that trust above all other men. Let him touch ground or bring disaster to a ship or to his men, and he must answer for what he has done. The choice is that, or an end to responsibility. And finally, then, an end to the confidence and the trust in the men who lead. For men will not long trust leaders who feel themselves beyond accountability for what they do. And then, order disintegrates into chaos, and powerful ships into uncontrollable derelicts. I would argue that's what's happened over the years since Jim Wright to our ship of state. Again, because of the lack of governance and the willingness to be accountable for it. I said at the beginning there was no higher honor and to speak here tonight and meet the man that I read a book twice just to know him. My office, it wasn't mandated, but everyone read the book because I couldn't stop talking. No higher honor was actually the motto of my first command. A small ship. We called him a small boy in the Navy. In the early 1990s. It was named after a ship that had been lost in the Battle of Lady Gulf in World War II in the Pacific, where Jim Wright fought. Alongside that ship was my father's ship in that battle. And as that ship was sinking, the captain sent his executive officer throughout to quickly find if there was anyone still alive on board before they all departed. And at the after-gun mount, the executive officer found Gunner Carr, just one of those sailors that everyone loves. A good guy. And there was Gunner Carr, his leg mangled, trying to get up on one leg with a shell in his arm to put it in a gun mount that was now askew and laying on its side. The executive officer took the shell and laid it on the deck and went off to get help. He came back with a stretcher and another man and found that Gunner Carr had crawled over and picked up that shell and was trying to get up on one leg to keep on fighting. The executive officer again took the shell out of the man's arms, laid it on the deck, and put him in a stretcher, got him to the bridge, put him in a lifeboat where he then died. But the captain of that ship, as he wrote his report on his accountability, as that ship later, because that ship sank, wrote the words that did become our motto. There was no higher honor than to have served with a man such as that. I envy any man and any woman who served with Speaker Wright. There could not have been any higher honor. So no, I meant what I said. When I received this invitation, I couldn't wait for tonight. And I'll always have to bear that I didn't have that honor of having served with him. Thank you very much.